Now back to the show. This is The Law Show on CL 650.
Hey, welcome back to The Law Show on CL 650. Today we're talking about immigration law, specifically the border. And joining us are experts Gordon Maynard and Alex Stojkovic from MKS Law in downtown Vancouver. We had a fascinating discussion around permanent residence and possible deportation. So enforcement issues at the border. We want to talk about residency. What does that mean, residency?
Well, Section 28 of the Act says that every permanent resident is obligated to show that they have been physically present in Canada for 730 days in every 5-year period.
Now, I just want to jump in because I travel a lot. No one stamps your passport when you leave the country. They only stamp it, or they only show it when you come back. So how do you show where you've been and what you've been doing?
So this is a
good
challenge.
Point.
This is a very good
point.
And
now,
why don't we stamp? I mean,
it'll come.
You think it'll come?
Yeah.
I mean, the challenge, I think, for some people is that, not stamping is often a good thing, right? So, why do they need to know everywhere I've been all the time? But,
well, for this, it is.
But for this, unfortunately, it is something you know. So people have had to, a culture has been created around that, plus the change to the citizenship law that says physical presence in Canada is required, have created a context now where you really have to keep track of where you've been. You're traveling, and in the case of CBSA, Canada Border Services, they luckily keep an entry record that goes by the unfortunate acronym of ICES, I-C-E-S, Integrated Customs Enforcement System.
Maybe it changes a foot there.
Yes, who knows. But anyway, so this system has all of your entries covered, but you still need to get all of your exits. So more and more countries are being compelled to people are being compelled to produce more and more entry and exit records from other countries. Some, like the United States, are not always that difficult to obtain. Unless you're a U.S. citizen, then they are, ironically. But in the case of other countries, they may have that available, or they may not have it available at all. The famous one in Canada is the French. The French refuse to give anybody entry and exit records. So let's say you write down on your application to renew your permanent resident card that you've been in France. You can't prove the other end of that unless they've stamped your passport.
So how does this affect enforcement issues at the border? This being in and out of the country and the time you're away.
Well, it affects permanent resident cards come up two different ways, really. Principally, first, you arrive at the port of entry and your card is close to expiring. Okay, and then the question arises: oh, what are you doing about renewing this? Where have you been? How long have you been gone? And especially if someone has been gone 5 years and now they're coming back just to renew the card, the question of whether or not they meet their obligation comes into question. Now, I said that you need to be in Canada 730 days in every 5-year period. That's not strictly speaking true. That's one of the ways you can satisfy your residency obligation. Gordon, what are some of the other ways?
If you are married to a Canadian citizen and you are accompanying them abroad, that counts as a day in Canada.
Really?
Yes, that's a benefit to marrying a Canadian and traveling abroad with them. If you're employed by a Canadian company and you're posted abroad as a condition of your employment, that can count as a day in Canada.
Now, I'll spin one for you. You're a permanent resident, and you work for an American company, and they transfer you to say you work for a tech company, you go down to Silicon Valley for a 2-year period, and then come back. That's not a Canadian company, but
nope.
That's not just a part of your work condition.
You are not doing yourself any favors.
No, now your residency obligation just became 2 years out of 3. Right. As opposed to 2 years out of 5, because they won't credit you any of that time, unless your spouse went with you and your spouse happens to be Canadian.
Can you get a pause in this? Can you say...
It's a very good question you ask. In the old days, you could. Pre-IRPA, there was something called a returning resident permit. This is the animal that they had. Now, that has largely been eliminated. So today, you would have to either prove that there are compelling humanitarian and compassionate circumstances to allow you to keep your status. That, hey, look, I just left for a little while and I had to work at this particular job because of some immediate issue. Family was sick, no one to take care of them, but now I really mean to come back and live here permanently. It's got to be something along those lines, or else you could have a real challenge keeping your status.
You would go back and look after elderly parents, maybe in the end of their life. for 2 years,
Yes.
for example. Ill, needed somebody to give them care. And then you come back. Could you, that under that old system, you could say, I was looking after elderly parents during the last days of their life, and I've come back now.
Well, you could keep applying for a special permit to allow you to continue to do that.
Right.
In this context, in the current context, what happens now is it's renewal of the card that becomes the point where this is adjudicated. And in Vancouver, there are so many of these issues that the unit that's responsible for doing secondary reviews is inundated. Like, it takes years now to get a card renewed if you're sent for secondary review. Because
Well, why would you be sent for secondary?
So are you talking about in the application for the PR card?
This is in an application for a PR card.
We've talked about this before on other shows. The process of applying for a new PR card is grotesque right now. If you've been here, your card's expiring, and you need to apply for a new card so you can travel with it, it's taking just under a year to get that card. And if they put it into the slow pile, if they send it for review, there is no timeline set for it, and realistically it's taking 2 years.
So your free legal advice today is if you are a permanent resident and your card is up for renewal within a year, get on it.
They say 9 months
Yeah,
right now.
yeah, definitely.
They allow you to apply 9 months early.
Do
I know
you
that
surrender
sounds
it
crazy,
while you're
but
asking for a new
No.
one?
No.
Okay, so
they
you
used
still
to
can
be
travel.
that way, but no longer.
So you still can travel under that card.
And this is a good opportunity to make a point here. You've been prefacing your questions about enforcement with reference to the border. Enforcement happens inside Canada. It happens at the border. It happens overseas in visa offices.
Well, I'll give you one. I was flying back from Munich, and there was a fellow, I can't remember what he had on his lapel, but he was checking everybody's documents to make sure that they were allowed to get on the plane.
Sure. So, like, permanent resident, so a foreign national requires a visa if they are not from a visa-exempt country. If you're from a visa-exempt country, you need a passport, although lately you also need an electronic travel authorization, something that came up in March. If you're a permanent resident, they're not supposed to let you on a common carrier, which would be an airline, if you don't have a valid PR card. This is not enforced everywhere, but nevertheless, it is what the law says. So if you don't have a valid PR card, it's a bit of a problem.
So if you were, say you put an application in to get it renewed with only 60 days left, and then you went, say, to Europe to visit family, and it had expired and it hadn't been renewed in that 60 days, you're in this limbo land, right?
You have the opportunity to apply at the visa post overseas for what's called a permanent resident travel document. And this is for permanent residents who are overseas and they don't have a valid card, and they need something to allow them to get onto a plane. What people don't realize is this is not the visa post being nice to you and helping you get back to Canada. This is an opportunity for the visa post to take enforcement action and to write you up for not living in Canada.
Well, it's a residency determination, so they expect the same documents as you would have on a PR card, like your tax returns, you know, maybe bank statements.
And you wouldn't have any of
Why
that
would
with
you have that when you're traveling?
Yeah.
Right?
So,
I mean, I'll give you a concrete example. I had a client who was Mexican who was in no residence issues. She was clearly in Canada. She just left on a trip to Mexico forgetting that her PR card expired. Ironically, she was called for a citizenship oath ceremony a month after all of this happened. She comes down to Mexico, tries to go back on the plane with her Canadian husband and her Canadian stepchildren, wouldn't let her on the plane because her PR card had expired. So she had to fly to Seattle, get a new ticket, fly to Seattle, and be picked up and driven over the border, showing her old confirmation of permanent residence document, which at a land border you're allowed to use something other than a PR card to prove your permanent residence. But had she not done that, she would have been stuck waiting for the Canadian Embassy in Mexico City to do a travel document application for her, which would have taken between 2 and 3 weeks. But even had it taken 4 days, this woman was on a 1-week trip to Cancun. You know,
spring break,
Spring break. She needs to be home now.
So what would have happened at that border if, when she's driving across the border, the CBSA at the border decides to question her about her residence history and demand that she demonstrate that she's been here 2 years out of 5? If she wasn't able to do so, they may have written her up for being in residency breach, and then she would have been out of luck on her citizenship application, which she's been invited to attend.
Right.
So I'm guessing that in Vancouver we have a lot of families from mainland China that have come And we hear all these stories about the mom and the kids, the mom's looking after the children. Children are going to school. Dad is back in China. He's working. He's making the money because that's where the money is made for these families. So under that instance, is they trying to catch people like that or misrepresenting themselves, saying they're in Canada when they're really back?
That's their number one target.
Is that right?
Number one target.
So what do they do?
They look for opportunities to write them up.
That's right. And you know, you feel for some people because some people really have businesses based here and they are trying to stay within the 730 days, but you know, and often in some instances they're even declaring all of their income in Canada. But at the same time, international business is such that they need to go and travel. And they're always in danger of you go a few more days this way or that way and you may violate the rules.
So if you're, let's get more free advice here. So you're a permanent resident and you need to travel a lot for work, and you might have another business in Europe or in Asia or what have you, and you're flying all the time. It's incumbent on you to keep records of when you're leaving and coming back?
Yes.
Yes.
You have to keep very good
Absolutely.
records.
You keep good records.
Yeah.
Every boarding pass, every itinerary. Every time you come back to Canada, your passport's going to be swiped. There's going to be a record of that.
Mm-hmm.
Make sure when you travel to foreign countries that a entry stamp is being put into your passport. A clear one.
Right.
Okay. It's hard to prove when you've been here and when you haven't.
Well, that's what seems amazing to me, that we don't have an exit strategy for Canada. I mean, I'll use China. I mean, China is the opposite. They are so strict. You get a little strip of paper,
That's right.
and you better not lose it,
Sure.
or you're sunk, because they want that when you leave.
There are exit records, absolutely. We don't have them yet, and I don't know that there's anything coming down the road that's going to show that the existence of an exit. But there it is. I mean, maybe one day we will have such a thing. At the moment, a strategy that your listeners can always use for both citizenship and permanent resident, a particularly novel one, is make sure your flight goes, if it's overseas, make sure that it leaves right before midnight, so that you can claim the day that you left as well as the day you traveled, both as days in Canada, because you're going to be in Canadian airspace until...
Is that a sneaky lawyer trick?
It's a sneaky lawyer trick, absolutely.
More free. We love the free advice. We'll continue our conversation next on CL 650.
There's more of the show still ahead. This is The Law Show on CL 650.